All right, let's jump right into this explainer of Carson McCullers' 1940 masterpiece, The Heart is a Lonely Hunter. Now, she published this when she was just 23 years old, which is absolutely wild to think about. But it's so much more than just a simple tragedy. What we're looking at is a profoundly layered exploration of human isolation, and it all centers around this mysterious deaf protagonist named John Singer. Through Singer, and the people practically gravitating toward him, McCullers builds a world that really forces us to examine how we communicate, how we project our own stuff onto other people, and how society itself just deepens our personal loneliness.
So, here's our agenda. Think of these 5 sections as a series of clues. We'll start with the pyramid of loneliness, then look at a Southern Gothic critique, move into religion as self-delusion, tackle the big debate of appropriation or allyship, and finish up with the tragedy of silence. We're going to start right at the emotional core of the story, expand out into the real socio-political pressures of the 1930s South, and end up in a fascinating modern debate in disability studies. Okay, Section 1. The Pyramid of Loneliness. We're starting right at the center of the narrative's gravitational pull.
We've got this core cast of deeply isolated people living in a 1930s Southern mill town. There's Mick Kelly, a tomboy who's just desperate to study music. We have Dr. Copeland, an incredibly idealistic black physician who's totally alienated from his own family. There's Jake Blount, a radical Marxist who recently rolled into town, and Biff Brannon, this observant but super lonely cafe owner. And sitting right in the middle of all of them is John Singer. The crucial thing to understand here is that every single one of these profoundly alienated characters is mysteriously drawn to Singer. They basically use him as this silent confidant, so they can escape their own spiritual loneliness, just pouring their hearts out to him day after day.
Scholar Yang Zhao sums up this dynamic perfectly, noting that Singer acts as a sort of silent sponge for all the townspeople's miseries. See, they all genuinely believe he holds some infinite wisdom and just completely understands them. But here is the profound irony of the whole situation. Singer himself is desperately lonely. His entire focus, his whole heart, is longing for his only true friend, Antonopoulos, a fellow deaf man who got sent away to an asylum. The townspeople are so entirely consumed by their own isolation that they are completely blind to his.
Moving to Section 2, a Southern Gothic critique. Let's zoom out to the societal ring and put these characters into their actual historical context.
McCullers leans really heavily into the Southern Gothic style. Now, if you're not familiar, this is a genre that uses the grotesque to highlight the brutal realities of social alienation. But she's definitely not doing this just for shock value. As scholars point out, she's using the Southern Gothic lens to neutrally and surgically expose the deep-seated systemic injustices of the post-World War I South in the 1930s. The personal isolation these characters feel, it's inextricably linked to the completely broken society they're living in.
Look at the intersectional pressures practically crushing each of these characters. Their loneliness isn't just some random emotional state. It is a direct, potent critique of the economics and politics of the era. Mick Kelly's dreams of being a composer, completely crushed by poverty and rigid gender roles. Dr. Copeland's intense isolation comes straight from systemic racism and his sheer exhaustion with the delusion of white superiority in the Jim Crow South. And Jake Blount's alienation is fueled by his frantic warnings about capitalist exploitation during the Great Depression, warnings that basically fall on deaf ears. The society itself is literally an engine of isolation.
All right, Section 3, Religion as Self-Delusion. This is the dramatic pivot where we see exactly how the townspeople cope with this crushing reality. Basically, they turn John Singer into a secular savior.
Biff Brannon, the cafe owner, is easily the most observant character in the novel, and he totally nails what's happening here. He watches these people construct this guiding principle entirely out of their own self-interested fantasies. Because Singer can't physically speak out loud to contradict them, they just fill his silence with their own desperate needs. They essentially turn him into this, quote, homemade god.
And the tragic juxtaposition of the whole novel really hits you when you look at these conflicting realities side by side. On one hand, you have the townspeople's projections. Mick talks to Singer about Mozart, just assuming he fully grasps the music playing in her head. Dr. Copeland looks at him and sees the one enlightened white man who gets racial justice. Jake Blount sees a fellow socialist revolutionary. But then, on the other hand, you have Singer's actual reality. He is entirely confused by them. He actually writes in a letter that he has no idea why they keep visiting or what they're even talking about. The hearing characters are projecting all their deepest desires onto him, totally ignoring his actual humanity. And tragically, Singer does the exact same thing with his friend Antonopoulos, assigning him this profound wisdom that the guy doesn't even possess.
Which brings us to Section 4,
appropriation, or allyship. Let's take everything we've talked about and look at it through the modern academic lens of disability studies. Did Carson McCullers appropriate deafness? This is a fiercely debated question in literary circles right now. See, McCullers was a hearing person. She chose to write a deaf protagonist without having that lived experience. She even famously refused to attend a convention for the deaf while writing the book. Because of that, modern scholars really debate the ethics of her representation. So, let's objectively look at both sides of this.
Critics often point to a concept called narrative prosthesis. In disability studies, this refers to authors using disability just as a crutch or a gimmick to advance a theme. So the argument here is that McCullers committed narrative prosthesis. Critics suggest she artificially isolated Singer, cutting him off from any actual deaf community, just to make his deafness a really convenient metaphor for universal human alienation. From this viewpoint, she appropriated deaf embodiment solely for her own literary goals.
But there is a very compelling counterargument for allyship here too. Scholar Alexander Steele points out that McCullers was herself a queer, multiply disabled woman. She suffered from strokes and paraplegia starting from a very young age. So she intimately knew what marginalization and bodily vulnerability felt like. Defenders argued that she intentionally kept Singer at a narrative distance, meaning she refused to write from inside his head, specifically to avoid unethically claiming an experience she didn't fully share. Looking at it this way, she was acting as an early, if maybe historically flawed, ally. She used her novel to aggressively critique how hearing people objectify and mistreat deaf individuals.
Finally, Section 5, the tragedy of silence. This takes us to the devastating climax of The Explainer, where the real-world consequences of turning a human into a metaphor become fatal. You can really track the deadly escalation of the town's behavior here. First, the townspeople fail to actually communicate with Singer. Instead, they just talk endlessly at him. Because they rely so heavily on his silence to feel comfortable, he actually suppresses his own urge to use sign language. It gets to the point where the novel describes his hands as becoming a torment to him. They enforce his silence, they strip away his humanity until he's just a symbol, and then he gets the news that Antonopoulos has died. We get this one rare, truly heartbreaking glimpse into Singer's perspective through a note he writes to Antonopoulos. He says he doesn't understand how people can open and shut their mouths so much without getting weary. You can feel the profound exhaustion here. You see the real harm caused by the townspeople's dehumanizing, completely one-sided reliance on him. He is literally suffocating under the weight of their words, completely unseen for who he really is.
And this all leads to a truly tragic outcome, the suicide of John Singer. Utterly shattered by the loss of his only real friend and completely isolated from any genuine reciprocal community, Singer ends his own life. The other characters are just left bewildered. Suddenly, their homemade god is gone. His death is a stark, devastating indictment of a society that values its own projections way more than the actual effort it takes to make a true empathetic connection.
So, I want to leave you with this final thought. As you reflect on the incredible, layered isolation of these characters we've just mapped out, think about how this classic text challenges us right now. It forces us to take a hard look at our own empathy. Are we actually listening to the people around us, or are we, just like the townspeople in McCullers' novel, merely using others as a mirror for our own delusions? It's definitely something to think about. Thanks so much for exploring this masterpiece with me.